For months, Minnesota was ground zero in America's immigration battle. Federal agents moved in. Families lived in fear. Protests filled the streets. Supporters called it law and order. Critics called it a crackdown. And now, in a dramatic shift, the operation is over. Why did President Trump suddenly end one of the most aggressive immigration enforcement surges in the country? Was it political pressure? Economic impact? Public backlash? Or part of a bigger strategy? Tonight, we're looking at a major shift in U.S. immigration policy. After months of heightened enforcement activity, federal authorities have officially ended what had become one of the most closely watched immigration crackdowns in the country, the large-scale operation in Minnesota. The decision marks a turning point in a policy effort that sparked protests, political debate, legal scrutiny, and national headlines. For months, Minnesota had become the focal point of a broader federal push targeting undocumented immigrants. The operation, widely known as a surge in immigration enforcement, involved increased ICE activity, coordinated arrests, workplace inspections, and expanded detention efforts. Supporters of the crackdown described it as a necessary step to restore order, strengthen border enforcement indirectly, and send a clear message that federal immigration laws would be enforced consistently across all states. Critics, however, saw something very different. They described the operation as aggressive, disruptive to communities, and in some cases overly broad. The end of the crackdown comes after mounting public pressure. Community groups in Minnesota organized rallies and town halls. Religious leaders spoke out. Local officials raised concerns about trust between immigrant communities and law enforcement. Business owners reported labor shortages in certain sectors. Civil rights organizations questioned whether some detentions were conducted with sufficient safeguards. Throughout the operation, federal officials maintained that the focus was on individuals with criminal records or outstanding deportation orders. They emphasized that the enforcement surge targeted public safety threats and repeat immigration violators. Administration representatives repeatedly argued that strong enforcement discourages illegal immigration nationwide and protects American workers. However, as the months passed, the narrative became more complicated. Reports surfaced that some detainees had no violent criminal history. Families were separated. Legal advocates stepped in to challenge individual cases. Immigration courts experienced additional strain as new cases flowed in. The political divide widened. President Trump defended the operation during its most intense phase, describing it as part of a broader commitment to law and order. He framed the crackdown as fulfilling campaign promises to enforce immigration laws more strictly. He also tied the Minnesota surge to national security concerns and broader debates about border control. But now, federal authorities have announced that the operation has concluded. ICE agents assigned specifically to the Minnesota surge are being reassigned. The administration says the objectives of the enforcement action have been met. Officials characterize the move not as a retreat, but as a transition to standard enforcement posture. The timing of the decision is significant. Political analysts note that immigration remains one of the most polarizing issues in American politics. Public opinion surveys show that while many Americans support stronger border control, there is also widespread concern about humanitarian impacts and family separations. Minnesota, in particular, has a diverse immigrant population, including large Somali, Latino, and Hmong communities, making enforcement actions especially visible and sensitive. For immigrant families in Minnesota, the end of the crackdown brings cautious relief. Community leaders say fear had become part of daily life. Some parents kept children home from school. Workers avoided certain areas. Small businesses reported customers staying away during peak enforcement periods. Now, local advocates say they hope trust can begin to rebuild. Law enforcement agencies in Minnesota also faced a complicated environment during the surge. While ICE operates under federal authority, local police departments often must balance cooperation with federal agencies against maintaining community relationships. Some local officials argued that aggressive immigration enforcement can discourage crime reporting, making communities less safe overall. At the same time, supporters of the crackdown argue that ending the surge sends the wrong message. They contend that consistent, visible enforcement deters illegal immigration and reduces strain on public resources. Some critics of the decision believe that scaling back operations could encourage future unauthorized entry into the country. The economic dimension of the crackdown also played a role. Minnesota's economy includes agriculture, food processing, construction, and service industries that rely significantly on immigrant labor. During the height of enforcement activity, certain sectors reported worker shortages. Economists note that sudden labor disruptions can ripple through local economies, affecting supply chains and prices. Politically, the decision to end the crackdown reflects ongoing negotiations within the broader immigration debate. Congress remains divided on comprehensive immigration reform. Efforts to modernize visa systems, address asylum backlogs, and strengthen border security have stalled repeatedly. Without legislative reform, administrations often rely on executive enforcement priorities, which can shift over time. The administration has emphasized that ending the Minnesota operation does not mean abandoning immigration enforcement. Officials say ICE will continue to pursue individuals with criminal convictions and outstanding deportation orders nationwide. They stress that enforcement resources will now be distributed more broadly rather than concentrated in one state. Civil rights organizations are calling for oversight and transparency moving forward. They want detailed reporting on how many individuals were detained, how many had criminal records, how many were released, and what safeguards were used to prevent wrongful detention. Legal advocacy groups are also pushing for reforms to detention standards and due process protections. For many residents of Minnesota, the past months have highlighted the human side of immigration policy. Stories of families facing uncertainty, employers navigating workforce instability, and communities grappling with fear have shaped the local narrative. At the same time, other residents express support for the crackdown, arguing that immigration laws must be upheld consistently. Nationally, immigration continues to be one of the defining issues of this political era. The Minnesota crackdown served as a microcosm of the larger debate: enforcement versus reform, security versus compassion, federal authority versus local autonomy. The decision to conclude the operation does not resolve those tensions. It simply marks the end of one chapter. As federal authorities transition out of the surge phase, attention may shift to other policy arenas, including border security funding, asylum procedures, and visa modernization. The administration faces pressure from multiple sides, some urging tougher enforcement, others calling for a more humane and comprehensive approach. The broader question remains: what is the long-term strategy? Is concentrated enforcement effective in deterring unauthorized immigration? Does it strengthen public safety? Or does it create unintended consequences that undermine community stability? The end of the Minnesota crackdown is not the end of the immigration debate. It is, instead, a moment of recalibration. Policymakers, communities, and advocacy groups will continue to wrestle with how best to balance law enforcement with humanitarian considerations. For now, Minnesota enters a period of adjustment. Families who felt targeted may feel a measure of relief. Businesses may stabilize. Law enforcement agencies may rebuild community trust. But the national conversation about immigration enforcement is far from settled. As this story continues to unfold, one thing is clear: immigration policy remains at the center of America's political and social landscape. The Minnesota crackdown may be over, but the debate about how to enforce immigration laws and how to reform them is ongoing. And in the weeks ahead, we'll be watching closely to see how this shift influences broader federal strategy, how communities respond, and whether new proposals emerge to address one of the most complex issues facing the nation today. As we continue to look deeper into this development, it's important to understand how this operation began in the first place. The Minnesota immigration surge was initially framed as a targeted response to what federal officials described as an increase in immigration violations and public safety concerns in specific regions. Authorities stated that intelligence and data analysis indicated clusters of individuals with outstanding deportation orders or prior criminal convictions residing within certain counties. The operation was designed to deploy additional personnel and resources to address those cases efficiently. In the early weeks of the crackdown, ICE teams conducted coordinated actions in multiple cities across Minnesota. These operations included home visits, workplace inspections, and traffic-related enforcement stops connected to immigration status checks. Federal officials emphasized that each action was based on existing warrants or deportation orders. They also maintained that agents were trained to follow strict procedural guidelines to prevent civil rights violations. However, the speed and visibility of the enforcement created a powerful public reaction. Social media amplified images of arrests and community gatherings. Advocacy groups quickly mobilized legal observers to monitor operations. Some local schools issued guidance to families on what to do if a parent was detained. Churches and community centers opened their doors to provide information sessions on legal rights. As the operation expanded, Minnesota's political leaders found themselves under pressure. Some state officials expressed concern about coordination between federal and local law enforcement. Questions arose regarding how much information local police were sharing with federal immigration authorities. In certain jurisdictions, local leaders clarified that they were not actively assisting with immigration enforcement beyond what federal law required. Meanwhile, supporters of the crackdown pointed to statistics released by federal agencies showing the number of individuals arrested who had prior convictions, including drug offenses, theft, and assault. They argued that the surge demonstrated the administration's commitment to enforcing immigration laws and protecting communities from individuals who had violated both immigration and criminal statutes. Over time, however, the narrative became more complex. Legal aid organizations reported cases where individuals detained had long-standing community ties and no violent criminal history. Some had pending immigration applications. Others were in mixed-status families, where children were U.S. citizens while parents were undocumented. These cases generated intense emotional responses and fueled protests. Protesters gathered outside federal buildings and detention centers, holding signs calling for humane immigration reform. Demonstrations remained largely peaceful but highly visible. National media outlets began covering the Minnesota operation as a symbol of broader enforcement trends. In Washington, the crackdown became a talking point on both sides of the aisle. Some lawmakers praised the administration's actions, arguing that consistent enforcement is essential for maintaining the integrity of the immigration system. Others criticized the operation as overly aggressive and lacking transparency. As months passed, immigration courts in the region saw an increase in hearings related to new detention cases. Judges faced crowded dockets. Attorneys scrambled to represent clients facing expedited removal proceedings. The backlog in immigration courts, already a national issue, became even more apparent in Minnesota.
Economic ripple effects also gained attention. Business associations in certain industries reported difficulties filling positions. Some employers expressed frustration, stating they were following employment verification laws and still found themselves navigating sudden labor gaps. Economists noted that abrupt workforce reductions in localized areas can disrupt supply chains, particularly in agriculture and food processing sectors. Within immigrant communities, daily life changed. Families created emergency plans in case of detention. Community groups distributed Know Your Rights cards explaining what to do during an ICE encounter. Some individuals limited travel, avoided public events, and reduced engagement with public services out of fear. At the same time, others in the state expressed support for the operation, arguing that immigration laws should be applied uniformly and that enforcement discourages unauthorized entry. Town hall meetings reflected this division, with passionate arguments from residents on both sides. The decision to end the crackdown appears to have been influenced by multiple factors: political pressure, economic considerations, community response, and evolving enforcement priorities at the federal level. Officials insist that the termination of the operation does not signal weakness, but reflects a shift back to standard operational procedures. According to federal statements, agents will continue to pursue individuals with serious criminal records, but without concentrating resources in one geographic area. This redistribution may indicate a broader strategy adjustment rather than a complete policy reversal. Policy analysts suggest that concentrated crackdowns often generate diminishing returns over time. Once initial targets are addressed, additional enforcement efforts may yield fewer high-priority cases while increasing community tension. Ending the surge may reflect a cost-benefit calculation within federal agencies.
Looking ahead, immigration remains a defining issue in national politics. With ongoing debates over border security funding, asylum processing reforms, and visa modernization, enforcement strategies are likely to continue evolving. The Minnesota case may serve as a reference point in future policy discussions. For affected families, however, the policy debate feels personal. The fear and uncertainty experienced during the crackdown will not disappear overnight. Community leaders say rebuilding trust requires consistent communication and transparency from federal authorities. Local officials are now exploring ways to strengthen community relationships. Some propose expanding legal education programs. Others are advocating for clearer guidelines on cooperation between local law enforcement and federal immigration agencies. National advocacy groups are pushing for legislative reform rather than episodic enforcement surges. They argue that only Congress can create lasting solutions by modernizing immigration laws, addressing backlogs, and clarifying pathways for legal status. Supporters of strict enforcement counter that until Congress acts, executive agencies must enforce existing laws. They warn that inconsistent enforcement could undermine the rule of law. The Minnesota crackdown highlights the broader tension between executive authority and legislative gridlock. Without comprehensive reform, administrations often rely on executive actions that can be expanded or scaled back depending on political priorities. In the coming weeks, attention will likely turn to whether similar concentrated operations are planned in other states, or whether federal agencies will focus on targeted enforcement nationwide without large-scale surges. Public reaction continues to evolve. Some residents welcome the conclusion of the operation, hoping for a return to stability. Others worry that ending the surge could reduce deterrence and encourage future violations. What remains clear is that immigration policy sits at the intersection of law enforcement, economics, human rights, and politics. The Minnesota operation encapsulated all of these dimensions. Its conclusion does not resolve the national debate. It underscores how complex and deeply felt the issue remains. As we move forward, policymakers will need to address the core questions that this operation raised. How should immigration laws be enforced? What balance should be struck between security and compassion? How can communities maintain trust while upholding federal statutes? And ultimately, can lasting solutions emerge from a system that has long struggled with comprehensive reform? For now, Minnesota steps into a new phase, one marked not by concentrated enforcement, but by the lingering impact of months of national attention. The story of this crackdown will likely influence immigration discussions for years to come.